to see you again. So today's lecture, and the title of the lecture today is A New Nuclear Order in the Making. And of course, it's a very complicated theme to deal with because what do we know about the future? But I think we have to deal with this topic because it's very, very important. Since it seems like we are moving from a system that served us well in many, many years, in many, many decades, so to speak. And we are facing a new situation where we can observe almost day by day that the nuclear order is not there as it used to be. We can talk about the dissolvement of the security architecture, the nuclear security architecture worldwide in many respects. And and to understand what is going on, we have to look into the bigger picture. The bigger picture is there are changes taking place worldwide, globally, of course. And what is happening at the nuclear level, in the nuclear policy field, is a reflection of what is taking place globally. And in a very wide perspective, I think we could bear in mind that we are in a process where we are moving from a bipolar system that was at play during the Cold War to a multipolar system. And the bipolar system that was at play during the Cold War was dominated by two superpowers, United States and Soviet Union. And it was a pretty predictable system. There were two equally strong superpowers with nuclear forces that, in a sense, played a game based on balance of power and deterrence capacity. Today, with a multipolar system in the international system, is less predictable. We don't have two superpowers. We have several great powers, some of them with nuclear weapons. And that is, once again, a less predictable system, and it's put into question whether deterrence policy work today. And we see a lot of changes, and I will come back to those changes very soon. But first, the content of this lecture. I think we have to look into the past, what has happened over the last 75 years since the two nuclear weapons were dropped in Japan. And the first phase and period we will deal with is from 1945 to 1969, which I called unregulated nuclear order. And then we will deal with the period 1970 until 2000, where we can say that a more regulated nuclear order was put in place. And finally, the main theme of this lecture, the period 2000 to 2020, a new nuclear order in the making, question mark, again, because it will be discussed if it's really correct to talk about a new nuclear order, or if we are on the way to a new nuclear order. Anyway, the first period, 1945 to 1969, which I called unregulated nuclear order, we have to understand shortly after the two nuclear weapons were dropped in Japan, there were efforts made in order to create a new system based on disarmament. And in United Nations, different initiatives were discussed. And one of the most important and famous initiatives at that time was the so-called Baruch Plan of 1946. Baruch was an American diplomat, and in UN, he presented a plan for getting rid of all nuclear weapons. which was based on a system that the world together, especially United States and Soviet Union, should create a system where the priority was first of all to get control of all nuclear material and then deal with disarmament. And then create an international atomic development authority that either should have the right of disposition of all the nuclear materials of the world, or if that was not possible, to reach that goal, or at least a control of all the nuclear material. And we know that control of the nuclear material has much, much later been taken care of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. Not the perfect system, but still it works pretty well. I come back to that later on. However, it's one idea to have grand ideas about creating a new system. And the Soviet Union, in fact, objected this idea. They went against the idea to have a control system first and then disarmament. And they, so to say, turned around on the logic and argued, first, we would like to see disarmament, and then we could have control of nuclear material. And behind that step, of course, was that Soviet Union at that time had their own goals, aims to acquire nuclear weapons. And it took place a couple of years later when the first atomic weapons test was carried out in 1949. So this part of UN broke down after 200 sessions, and that was the end of disarmament issues for many, many years, for many, many decades, because it was considered as a dead duck. It was impossible to deal with disarmament issue when also Soviet Union had reached that goal. So we lived from there in a new world, so to speak. And especially so, also so when Great Britain carried out its first nuclear weapon test in 1952. But instead, something else developed out of those discussions and world affairs relationships between the United States and Soviet Union. And that was called the Athens for Peace. It was an initiative taken by President Eisenhower. And instead of trying to have a monopoly situation where everything should be controlled by United States, in a sense, nuclear material, that was the purpose before Soviet Union could acquire nuclear weapons. Eisenhower understood we need to cooperate, the world need to cooperate, United States and Soviet Union need to cooperate, because it's impossible in the long run to control nuclear material. So instead of trying to prevent states from dealing with nuclear energy, conduct research, states should in fact be encouraged to take part in different kind of cooperation project. And that became the Athens for Peace project. And a couple of very important conferences were held where states were invited to take part in this cooperation in order to develop civilian nuclear energy, and if they at the same time promise not to use the technology and the nuclear material, enriched uranium and so on and so forth, to acquire nuclear weapons. And out of that, the IAEA was created based on all the discussions, scientific conferences, political maneuvers between United States and Soviet Union. But we have to understand, at that time, when the IAEA was created, IAEA didn't have any power, they couldn't deal with safeguards, control, and so on and so forth. That was impossible at that time. And the reason for that was that United States and Soviet Union were in the middle of a nuclear arms race, and they many were afraid that more and more states should acquire nuclear weapons. and they were not interested to have a total control of nuclear material at that time. So it was deemed as an impossible, unrealistic goal. But instead, as we know, more and more nuclear weapons was manufactured, and the nuclear arms race was about to steer out of control. And in 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev understood that something has to be done. We need to find some kind of control. We need to find some kind of agreements. We need to deal with disarmaments. We need to deal with non-proliferation in order to prevent the further spread of nuclear weapons. But it's easy to have, once again, grand ideas. It's very difficult to put that in place. So the period 1945 until 1969, you could conclude was a period of very much uncontrolled nuclear arms race. And many were afraid that the world would run into a nuclear war. We were very close to a nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We know that. Historians and political scientists have digged in the archives, and it's quite a common ground to argue that the world was very close to a nuclear war. Of course, some disarmament talks were taking place between the Soviet Union and the United States, but there were no substantial results. And in fact, those talks started in the end of 1950s, but there were no interest on either side to really make change or move forward in this respect. But on the other hand, nuclear proliferation was considered as a very, very risky business. And President Kennedy in 1961 delivered a very important speech where he was afraid that the world could face around 25 nuclear weapon states around 1970s if not measures were seriously taken to prevent that from happening. So it was a very, in many respects, very insecure world. The nuclear weapon states, they increased the nuclear forces, and there was no control. Of course, they, in a sense, checked each other with different kinds of intelligence systems and so on and so forth. And it was a bipolar system. It was, in a sense, more predictable that we can see in a multipolar system, but it was not a robust system in many respects. So the next period, 1970 until 2000, here we can talk about an emergence of a regulated nuclear order. And of course, the most important arrangements that was put into effect was the Treaty on Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons. It was signed, open for signing by governments in 1968, and the ratification process started in 1970. And it was considered as a real success because in the beginning of 1960, not that many states, especially not United States and the Soviet Union, believed that it was possible to create such a system that more and more states, and the majority of the states, the member states of the United Nations, would adhere to. But it became real. And it's also important to say that the NPT treaty in itself also was combined with different kind of arrangements like export control regimes, physical protection to protect the nuclear material and other sensitive material that are used in civilian energy production, and so on and so forth. And arms control, yes, you can also argue, and I think that is true in many respects, that Soviet Union and United States really made efforts to work out, design a more robust arms control system. And a couple of important agreements were signed between the two superpowers. For example, in 1969, the Strategic Arms Limitation, which was deemed as a very, very important step in order to freeze the existing ballistic missiles to a certain at a certain level. And SALT II in 1972, that was in 1972, sought to limit the manufacture of strategic nuclear weapons, which had its problem because it was not ratified, but at the same time, it was in practice paid attention to. And then also the anti-ballistic missile treaty reduced the nuclear sites used to nuclear missile sites, which was a very, very important step forward. And then, of course, START 1 and, in 1991 and START 2 in 1993, two important agreements which reduced the number of nuclear weapons dramatically. Okay, then the end. It was after the Cold War, so it was easier to move in that direction. And here's the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty between United States and Soviet Union that reduced the number of intermediate nuclear weapons, so to speak, just to give you a glance of how they fought at the time. So if I should try to conclude the period 1970 to 1999, I would say it was a big success story. We can talk about a regulated nuclear order, both in terms of non-proliferation and also arms control. So deterrence, you could argue if deterrence worked whatsoever, but in theory, and at least Soviet Union, United States pay attention to it. It was a policy that they, in many respects, complied to, and they sought in different actions, agreements to create a balance of power. So they would want around the risk to run into a nuclear war. It could be argued if it may be some kind of more of luck at play at that time, but still it was in many respects, that's my conclusion, a pretty robust system, and many states believed in that system. So it was a strong belief in cooperation in this period, of course, based on convergent interest, because both Soviet Union and United States have convergent interest to stop other states from going nuclear, of course. And as a result, the nightmare that President Kennedy expressed in his speech in 1961 was not realized. It was not, during that period, we couldn't see birth of 25 new nuclear weapon states. Of course, we saw a couple of other nuclear weapon states, absolutely, but not that many thought was possible. And it was once again an arms control system based on balance of power and deterrence. Okay. What about the period, the period between 2000 and 2020? Can we talk about a new nuclear order in the making? And I look forward to discuss this with you after my presentation. But I think first we have to see this from a bigger perspective, what's going on globally on an overarching perspective in the international system. Once again, we have moved from a bipolar system to a multipolar international system, which is less predictable, absolutely. And we have to understand that what's going on in the nuclear policy field is nothing that's taking place in a vacuum. It's a reflection of world politics, world affairs, the relationships between great powers and the relationships between different actors in the international system, not only states, could also be non-governmental organization, international media, and so on and so forth. And many security experts are arguing that geopolitics is back on the agenda again. We cannot, we all know that, talk about the bipolar system dominated by two superpowers. We see a couple of great powers that want to play an important role in the world, but not only on the global level, more, I would say, on the regional level. And that is very important. I'll come back to that later. And it seems that this in itself creates less ground for global cooperation. We see that especially now in the United States, but also in Russia, where they not only in the nuclear field or abandon agreements and show a disinterest to take part and be responsible for creating a legally stronger international system. So it's less ground for global cooperation in this dynamic geopolitical international system that we see is emerging. We can see that in many, many aspects. At the same time, we have to understand that what we see is also a power shift from the Western world and the United States to Asia and China. And that also creates its specific dynamics. Maybe moving more from global affairs to regional affairs, where regional conflicts would probably increase, many argue. And I think there's some truth in that argument. Regional dynamics is becoming more and more important, and that increased the risks of conflicts, military conflicts. We have, as you know, in Asia, many conflicts areas. We have the two nuclear weapon states, India and Pakistan, who have strong tensions in between them. We have North Korea, and many are afraid of a chain reaction of proliferation because of North Korea's nuclear program, and so on and so forth. But we also have a regional dynamics taking place in Middle East, where we have Iran, who has been trying to acquire nuclear weapons, as we see. That creates a very dynamic and complex security situation. So regional dynamics seems to be back again, and this was a long time ago. We saw regional conflicts. It was before the Cold Wars started, so to speak. And also, if we specifically deal with the nuclear order and what's taking place in the area of nuclear policy, we see a modernization of existing nuclear weapon system in the United States, in Russia, but also partly in China and in other countries as well, nuclear weapon states. And it's very costly upgrading programs. It costs, for instance, in United States, trillions of dollars to upgrade the nuclear weapon system in the upcoming decades. And also important to put into context here is a new type of nuclear weapons is about to be manufactured, and it's called low-yield nuclear weapons. And low-yield nuclear weapons, according to President Trump, could be used in the battlefield, produced to be used in the battlefield. And that is very important to understand, because during the Cold War and up until, I would say, now, more or less, or for a couple of years ago, the arms control was based on the purpose that a nuclear war should not be allowed to break out. Nuclear weapons should stabilize the world order. If that was just dreams and theories, we could argue, but that was the idea. But this new kind of low-yield nuclear weapons is produced in order to be used in the battlefields. If that is just rhetoric or not, we could discuss, but at least we see that as a fact. And also, another important aspect that we have to add to the picture is an emerging technology, new technology, super technology, like artificial intelligence, cyber, and different kind of new technological systems that has blurred, many argue, the boundaries between nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. It will be much harder to decide what's going on because conventional advanced weapons with the technology is integrated in the nuclear weapon systems, and especially that is very worrisome in regions, complex security-ridden regions where decisions has to be made very quickly to really decide if the adversary is attacking with conventional weapons or nuclear weapons. And that has detrimental consequences, of course, for the deterrence theory, which I come back to later on in next Wednesday's lecture, when I will deal with deterrence policy in a multipolar world. And yes, we can all see, observe, television, reading of newspapers, and so on and so forth, that the security architecture, especially in the nuclear field, is collapsing in front of our eyes. But I think we have to understand this as a process that did not started 4 or 5 years or 6 years ago with the annexation, Russian annexation of Crimea. Many believe, oh, that changed everything. No, in fact, I believe this process started much earlier, in fact. I mean, it's not black and white, but I would say that something happened to the disarmament ambitions and to have a more stabilized nuclear order in 1998 when India carried out a nuclear weapons test, followed by Pakistani nuclear weapons test. That at that time shocked the world and put into question if we are moving in the right direction. At that time, it was played down after a while and so on and so forth. But we also have to remember that the anti-ballistic missile treaty was abandoned early as 2002. And the very important, the cooperative threat reduction, that was a very well-respected cooperation between Russia and United States, was terminated in 2012. But everybody couldn't ignore the fact that something had really happened, something very negative, when the INF, Intermediary Nuclear Forces Treaty, was abandoned first by Russia and then United States in 2019. In practice first, but then also in real terms. That made Europe a less secure continent. And what many worries about is, of course, the New START that was signed 2010 with the purpose of reducing the nuclear forces of the world. That agreement will expire in January 2021, and most likely it will be abandoned. Even though some efforts are made in order to stop that from happening. There are a couple of foreign ministers in Germany, in Sweden, and other states that are trying to have a dialogue with the United States and Russia to at least prolong the New START for a time. So new negotiation could take place in the future to have some kind of, if needed, a replacement or a strengthening of the New START agreement and so on and so forth. But if it will be abandoned, we have an even more dangerous situation, I would argue. And also, I think it's important to understand the role of China in all this. As I mentioned, we are in the middle of a power shift from the Western world, United States, to Asia and China. And some argue that China will sooner or later be a stronger part, an important part of the nuclear order. It shouldn't only be United States and Russia. And in the United States, President Trump maintained that the problem with New START is that it's just a relationship based between what's going on and what is happening in Russia, in the United States. We need to have China included. But China has so far not shown any interest in moving that direction. And I can see why, because first of all, they are not interested to upgrade the nuclear weapons to a scale to compete with Russia and Russia and the United States. They are pretty safe to have a small, maybe a little bit stronger in the future, nuclear arsenal. And their focus in China, the Beijing's focus is to have to dominate the future of the economics, the world economy, trade, and so on and so forth, to be a superpower in that respect, and not to play some kind of new nuclear arms game with Russia and United States. On the other hand, we don't know what will happen in the future. It might be true that sooner or later China has to step in to be part of some kind of system, triangle system, trilateral system, whatever you call it. But China is an important player, and we have to pay attention to China, even in the nuclear field. Okay, another aspect, an important aspect of what's going on is proliferation risks. We talked about nuclear renaissance a week ago, and perhaps it's a little bit exaggerated to talk about renaissance of nuclear power, but in some areas such in Asia, we see an increasing role of nuclear power, and that could be also a risk if we take a look at this from a proliferation risk. What's going on between India and Pakistan, the North Korean nuclear weapons could have consequences in a sense that states, neighboring states with civilian nuclear energy, nuclear power capacity could sometime in the future, when they feel they are threatened, try to acquire nuclear weapons. Maybe the risk is small, but I think we have to put that into the calculation as well. Another risk is nuclear terrorism. If there are more and more nuclear actors, especially in Asia, maybe in Middle East as well, there's a growing risk for nuclear terrorism, theft and sabotage, which also has to be taken care of and pay attention to. And talking about proliferation risk in certain areas, the so-called the Iranian deal, or the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which United States abandoned. And we know that Iran today has stepped up its plans to enrich uranium. And let's say if Iran acquire nuclear weapons in the future, it's most likely that Saudi Arabia, Egypt will try to do the same. And then it could create a further chain reaction of proliferation. And of course, North Korea and the North Korean nuclear weapon threats can create a similar potential chain reaction. Let's say if South Korea and Japan don't trust the security guarantees from United States in the future. And there's some doubts that have been observed in both South Korea and Japan in that respect. That could also lead to proliferation risk that South Korea and Japan are moving in that direction. We shouldn't exaggerate the threat here, but there's a risk here at least. There's a risk. Okay, consequences, the period 2000 to 2020, a new nuclear order in the making, question mark. I would say the transition from a bipolar international system to a multipolar international system has definitely weakened the deterrence policy in practice. You could argue maybe it never worked, but I think it worked somehow, especially during the Cold War, and especially until, I would say, 10 years ago, in many respects, even though it was not the perfect system whatsoever, and it could be many question marks could be raised here. But in a multipolar system, especially in a conflict-ridden area, it's very hard to see that deterrence will work as it was thought to work, in theory at least. And the deterrence theory is a product of the Cold War and the relationship between the United States and Soviet Union, two superpowers in a pretty robust, predictable system. That's not what we see today, and especially in some areas. So this deterrence policy we have to pay attention to. Could we really rely on it, and especially in some areas of the world? And this overarching transition from a bipolar international system to a multipolar, and the highlighting of regional politics has also increased the risks for regional conflicts. And if we take Asia as an example, we know many states have nuclear weapons capacity in Asia. And if a military conflict is at hand, it's easy to imagine that miscalculation because of the blurred boundaries between conventional weapons and nuclear weapons can be misinterpreted and can turn into a nuclear war. We shouldn't exaggerate, but there is a risk there, absolutely. And especially, no doubt, the risk for regional conflict has grown. And also, a consequence is it seems like we are in the beginning of a new nuclear arms race. In the mid-1980s, there were around 70,000 nuclear weapons, and today, roughly speaking, around 15,000 nuclear weapons. But it seems, especially United States and Russia, are about to produce nuclear weapons, and that will most likely lead to a new nuclear arms race, and perhaps other states will follow suit. And then once again, the role of China. Can we talk about the trilateral system or the prospect for a future trilateral nuclear system where China is included? Many argue that is what we have to expect of the future. Others argue that, well, we have to say what we can say of the old nuclear order. We shouldn't throw out the child with the bathwater, so to speak. But it's an open question, and I'd like to discuss this issue with you. And another consequence could be, I don't say it's going to be like that, less opportunities for effective global and regional cooperation. On the other hand, it could be argued that because of the risky situation we are in, that could be good incentives to really try to move forward again, to create a stronger legal international system based on effective global cooperation. But right now, what we see, we don't see that global cooperation is highly supported by some great powers, especially Russia and United States. And also the nuclear norm that especially the nuclear ban treaty has pushed for, and also many states, is under enormous stress. And US political scientist Nina Tannewald has argued that the nuclear norm is about to lose ground, or at least the nuclear norm is under stress. And if people, state leaders, countries, don't pay attention to nuclear norm that is against international, should be against international law, against ethics and good moral to possess nuclear weapons and use nuclear weapons, that is also a negative development, of course, especially if we believe in a more stabilized world and hopefully without nuclear weapons in the future. So I think I stop here, and I'm looking forward to discuss this theme with you. Thank you very much.